If you're considering buying a PlayStation VR2, or maybe you've already ordered one, or maybe you already have one, I think you'll find some value here because we're going to go over some tips, tricks, setting expectations, and things you really should know. I think we should start right away with the expectations because this is going to depend greatly on what you've heard and also where you're coming from when it comes to VR headsets, which could be a number of things. You've never owned a VR headset before, or you're coming from the first PSVR, you're coming from a MetaQuest 2, you're coming from a MetaQuest Pro, or you're coming from PCVR like the HP Reverb G2 or the Pico or something like that. Again, there's a number of ways this can go, but I think primarily if you're coming from nowhere, not having a frame of reference of trying VR, and this would be your first headset, then generally I think it's a safe bet to say that you will enjoy it, as in it kind of has that wow factor. That seems to be the case for a lot of people, is that the first time you try it, it's really exciting and cool. Although I will say, there's always this misunderstanding with what VR really looks like. It's not a crystal clear image. It's not the same as looking at a 4K TV, a game running at a native 4K resolution. It's not like that at all, and so you do have to prepare for that. Also, you do have to be mindful of motion sickness, so if you are a first-time VR user, don't be bold and jump into a racing game. You really want to try something that is a bit more stationary, so that could be things like Job Simulator or Moss, something to really ease yourself into, and that's where you can explore many comfort settings, which many games do offer, to make it a bit easier to get a better baseline knowledge of how motion sick you may or may not get. Now, if you're coming from only the first PSVR, and let's say maybe you're skeptical about trying another Sony headset because you didn't like the first one or you had some frustrations, which are totally understandable, but here is where you're going to see a massive jump in quality across the board. And it's not even something where we have to single out the main headline features of PSVR2, like the increase in resolution, the eye tracking, the foveated rendering, the haptics. All that stuff is great, but really it's the fact that Sony has now gone with a standardized tracking setup, having inside-out tracking, not needing an additional camera accessory facing you. The more reliable tracking, the single USB-C cable, it's just a massive quality of life jump that makes this so much more accessible, and that alone I think is something you'll really enjoy, having that familiarity of the first PSVR. Now, if you're coming from other headsets like the MetaQuest 2 or PCVR, which again has a range of HMDs to choose from, this is where, generally speaking, we can say PSVR2 is extremely competitive for what you're getting when we factor in the all-in cost. So MetaQuest 2, as an example, is extremely affordable because it's an all-in-one device, you don't have to hardwire it to anything, and there's a lot of value and utility in that. But if you want the nicer picture quality, if you want a more premium VR experience, PSVR2 will deliver on that front. But that's why if you're coming from, say, PCVR, you may not really find this to be a mind-blowing experience, given that we have to assume you already have a capable PC rig that can run a lot of high-quality VR games today. So there is the haptics, there's the eye tracking, there's a small selection of exclusive games, but that may not be enough as it stands right now. You may not be blown away coming from PCVR. It's the all-in cost that is really making PSVR2 such an attractive option, because you only need a PS5, which all in, little over $1,000. You're going to get a very good experience having spent that versus PCVR if you're coming from, say, nothing. Now, if you're coming from MetaQuest Pro, different story, because MetaQuest Pro uses pancake lenses, and those lenses in particular solve a big problem with the current Fresnel lenses that many headsets, PSVR2 included, use. So that's why we have to talk about picture quality and the expectations for virtual reality today. This is an important thing to understand with virtual reality, because depending on how you're perceiving the high praise PSVR2 has gotten, you might be walking into this headset thinking it's going to look crystal clear, and that is not going to be the case. Now, it will look good, but again, it's just the expectations. That and making sure you are in fact getting the best image quality possible. You might have heard about the sweet spot, the point at which the lens is in the correct position, and you're seeing the VR displays as intended. Some folks may very well be playing with a blurry image not knowing that it can be improved, but there are also visual drawbacks that are considered normal. So let's address those first. Assuming you've aligned the headset correctly, and text is sharp as you're looking directly at it, you may notice on the very outer edges that there is a slight blur. That is normal. There's no getting your entire view crystal clear, especially considering many games you play on PSVR2 may use foveated rendering or have comfort settings that obscure your peripheral view. The point is, most of what you see head-on should be clear, but slight blurriness on the outside is normal. God rays are a visual artifact that occurs on a high contrast scene, like for example light-colored text on darker colored backgrounds. You may notice the text has a glowing appearance, and this is simply a byproduct of the Fresnel lenses of PS VR2. Most headsets nowadays use these, and this is a consequence of that. It's prominent in the example given, but it may appear in any high contrast scenario. If you notice it, this is normal. Then there's the screen door effect. It's called that because if you can picture a fine mesh screen door sitting in front of your game, then that's what that'll look like. This is caused from the space in between pixels not being completely filled in, so you're actually noticing the gaps of all those pixels, which makes a screen door-like filter on top of what you're seeing. For explanation's sake, that's what it is, but in reality the screen door effect is minimal on PS VR2. The real issue you may notice or encounter is called Mmmmm. Mmmmm is basically an unevenness of colors, which tends to be more pronounced on OLED displays, which PS VR2 has. So in scenes that display a lot of the same color, this artifact may become more noticeable. It's not quite the screen door effect, it's more of a noisy layer, or maybe it's best described as grainy. Either way, this is also, given the current technologies, normal, but we will talk about minimizing this in a bit. Next, there's also chromatic aberration. This is where you might be noticing color ever so slightly bleeding off of things, almost like it has an outline that seems like it shouldn't be there, and that's true. Chromatic aberration is a sign that you don't have your headset aligned properly, as this effect can be kept at a minimum assuming you're in the sweet spot. Now finally, there's also reprojection artifacts. Reprojection is something you're going to encounter playing PS VR2 games. A lot of developers are using this, much like they did on the first PSVR, and it's something where if a game's a bit more graphically intensive, or if there's just not enough headroom for what they want to accomplish visually, so that could be things like GT7, Horizon Call the Mountain, RA Village, then they'll opt for reprojection, which is where a game will run at, say, a native 60 frames, but then this technology comes in as a bit of guesswork and mimicking to add in those additional frames, and that's also tied directly to your head movements, and your predicted head movements, I should say, to try and create a smooth 120 frames per second experience without the computational budget required to actually do native 120. The point is, there are some drawbacks to this. It could be a ghosting effect, or persistence blur, or some kind of motion blur is how people tend to describe it, but essentially it depends on how you're interacting with and looking at the current scene. So you could be stationary looking at a fast-moving object, you could be stationary moving your head very fast looking at stationary objects, you could be using smooth locomotion while again looking at stationary objects. That's normally how this effect becomes a bit more prominent, but given the context of PSVR2 and what developers are choosing to do with their games, that's why all of this is also technically considered normal. And that's also why this is another advantage coming from PC VR, budget withholding, and based on developer support. You could, if you want to, turn off reprojection and avoid this issue entirely. But if we want to minimize the problem on PSVR2, what can we do? There's really only one thing, which is lowering the brightness level from the quick settings card. Try dialing this down to about 65 to 70%, and you could even go lower, but it does tend to have an effect on minimizing the appearance of all of these, including the Mmmmm effect. Now, there's a bit of a trade-off, obviously. The games don't look nearly as vibrant. I prefer to have it at full brightness or near full, but you can certainly minimize the appearance if you lower the brightness from the quick settings card. So now that we know what's normal and what isn't, let's find the sweet spot. PSVR2 is definitely a bit narrow on this, but thankfully the eye adjustment setting gets us off to a strong start by showing us an on-screen representation of how your eyes should be centered in the lens animation on screen. So adjust the dial on the visor to get this right. After that, the big thing to address is the vertical adjustment of the headset. This isn't explained as clearly by Sony, but generally when putting PSVR2 on, you want this at a slight angle. The rear band should be lower and the visor higher. Now, everyone's different, so this certainly won't be a one-size-fits-all, but basically we're going for a slight angle. Just make sure you're adjusting this part as well, all the while looking at text in the headset. Text is the easiest way to see and verify you've got a clear picture, so just stare at some words during the VR2 adjustment settings until you found the sweet spot that works best for you. After you found it, that's when you tighten the dial on the back and get to playing. This is where you should have minimal screen door effect or chromatic aberration. But again, I do warn, people simply have different tolerances to these things. If you still see them with a clear picture and it bothers you, that's okay, but perhaps the technology isn't far along enough for where your tolerance level is at. So to cap things off, let's go over a few other tips here worth pointing out. First off, PS VR2 demos. Of course, there's a nice little handy link on the store. Hit that. Here's all the demos. Not a whole lot currently, or at least not compared to the first PSVR, but that's not going to stay there forever, so if you want to get to that again, you can go to collections. All the way down in the very bottom is PSVR2 again for the same specialized page to get to demos, but this also likely will not stay up for a long time either, so at least under the latest section, and this will be future-proofed for as long as Sony has this on here, this horizontal row for demos. Now this will include everything, but if we just scroll all the way over, view all, and directly on console we can just use sorting options for VR, PSVR2, and we see the same options, right? So this will be, in theory, future-proofed as more demos come to the store, and you may not know about each demo that comes on here, but, you know, check this periodically, and as long as nothing is delisted, this should only get bigger and bigger over time. Next up, this one might be fairly obvious, but for those that don't know, a double tap of the PS button is always going to be your best friend on PS5. So normally, if it's a standard 2D PS5 game, a double tap will bring up the most relevant card for what you're doing in that game, like a main mission story card or some sort of side mission card, whatever you last used. Unless you're in a voice chat or using Spotify, that will replace the double tap shortcut, but in the case of PSVR2 games, a double tap will bring up the quick settings card, and it does it in gameplay, so if you need to quickly reference some of these common or uncommon settings, you can do it right here with a double tap. Always keep that in mind. Now, going into the settings of PSVR2, there's really two items of note here that are really cool. First would be cinematic mode. So for the video output, we can actually output 120 Hz to the VR headset for purely the cinematic mode, which would mean playing standard 2D PS5 games. Now, once we start doing that, we're going to lose the signal to the TV, so you can't have somebody watch you, or you can't play from the TV, obviously, but it's meant to allow high frame rate mode games to be played on PSVR2 during cinematic mode. So you could play God of War with an unlocked frame rate, or Warzone, or Uncharted Legacy of Thieves Collection. If there's any high frame rate mode game, you can play that on PSVR2 without needing a fancy new TV, HDMI 2.1. You don't have to do that. You can do that with purely PSVR2, which is pretty cool. The other useful setting in here is called tracking support. So you would turn this on and you get this really wacky border going all around the screen, and you might be wondering, how does this help tracking when PSVR2 uses inside-out tracking? As in, you don't have to face the TV, you don't even need the TV on, so why would this help tracking? This description is making the assumption that you are facing the TV, and that's what's causing the problems, because you could be in a situation where PSVR2 is being overexposed with your well-lit room, and a TV could be a very well-lit device that's messing up your tracking. So if you want to have the TV on, as in you want somebody to watch you play, then enabling this would tell your PSVR2 to ignore this as a giant source of light. Otherwise, you don't have to enable this. You could look away from the TV, you could turn the TV on. That would also, in theory, improve your tracking support if you are in a situation where there's too much light that's interfering with your play. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it and found something useful in here. And if you haven't just yet, please consider subscribing for the best PlayStation news, reviews, and updates that are here on YouTube. You can also follow me on Twitter @MysticRyan, and that is it. I will see you all in my next video. You take it easy.